In March of 1945, a woman named Elsie Mitchell led 5 children into the pine woods of Bly, Oregon, and what happened next shocked even the hardened military intelligence officers who had spent 3 years preparing America for the worst. She was not walking into a battlefield. She was not in a war zone. She was 26 years old, pregnant, on a Sunday picnic with her husband and the kids from his church youth group, in a forest so quiet the only sound was wind moving through the Douglas firs. And then she touched something half buried in the snow. Not a rock, not a fallen branch. Something taut. Something with wires. The explosion that followed was not a battle. It was not an ambush. It was not the result of any failure of American intelligence or military defense. It was the result of a weapon so alien in its design, so quiet in its arrival, and so invisible in its journey, that the United States government did not fully understand what it was for months, and when they finally did, they made a decision that may have cost American lives. They buried the story entirely. Not as a precaution, not as protocol, but as something far more calculated. A silence designed to protect a war effort while leaving ordinary American citizens walking unknowingly through forests seeded with death from 30,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. By the summer of 1945, over 9,000 of these weapons had been launched. They had traveled 6,000 miles on jet stream winds from the coast of Japan to the forests, fields, and farmlands of North America. They had landed in Oregon, Montana, Wyoming, Iowa, Kansas, and as far east as Michigan. At least 6 people were dead, all of them civilians, 5 of them children, and the United States military had known for months that these weapons existed, knew they were landing, and had ordered every newspaper, radio station, and local official in the country to say nothing. The sky had been at war with America, and no one was allowed to say so. Before we uncover the disturbing truth behind Operation Fugo, the most ambitious and bizarre secret weapons program of World War II, subscribe to this channel, hit that bell so you never miss a story like this, and drop your country, state, or city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story reaches, because what happened in those American woods in 1944 and 1945 is something they kept quiet for decades, and it deserves to finally be heard.
In March of 1945, a woman named Elsie Mitchell led 5 children into the pine woods of Bly, Oregon, and what happened next shocked even the hardened military intelligence officers who had spent 3 years preparing America for the worst. She was not walking into a battlefield. She was not in a war zone. She was 26 years old, pregnant, on a Sunday picnic with her husband and the kids from his church youth group, in a forest so quiet the only sound was wind moving through the Douglas firs. And then she touched something half buried in the snow. Not a rock, not a fallen branch. Something taut, something with wires. The explosion that followed was not a battle. It was not an ambush. It was not the result of any failure of American intelligence or military defense. It was the result of a weapon so alien in its design, so quiet in its arrival, and so invisible in its journey, that the United States government did not fully understand what it was for months. And when they finally did, they made a decision that may have cost American lives. They buried the story entirely, not as a precaution, not as protocol, but as something far more calculated, a silence designed to protect a war effort while leaving ordinary American citizens walking unknowingly through forests seeded with death from 30,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. By the summer of 1945, Over 9,000 of these weapons had been launched. They had traveled 6,000 miles on jet stream winds from the coast of Japan to the forests, fields, and farmlands of North America. They had landed in Oregon, Montana, Wyoming, Iowa, Kansas, and as far east as Michigan. At least 6 people were dead, all of them civilians, 5 of them children. And the United States military had known for months that these weapons existed, knew they were landing, and had ordered every newspaper, radio station, and local official in the country to say nothing. The sky had been at war with America, and no one was allowed to say so. Before we uncover the disturbing truth behind Operation Fugo, the most ambitious and bizarre secret weapons program of World War II, subscribe to this channel, hit that bell so you never miss a story like this, and drop your country, state, or city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story reaches, because what happened in those American woods in 1944 and 1945 is something they kept quiet for decades, and it deserves to finally be heard. To understand why the balloon bombs worked, not just as weapons, but as a psychological operation, you have to understand what America looked like from the inside in 1944. The country was mobilized in a way it had never been before, and has never been since. Entire industries had been converted overnight. The Ford plant in Willow Run, Michigan, was producing a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Women who had never held a wrench were building warships. Teenagers were growing victory gardens in their backyards. The entire architecture of American civil society had been reorganized around a single proposition: that the war was over there, and America was over here, and the job of every American citizen was to work, produce, sacrifice, and wait for the men over there to win. This separation, the absolute psychological distance between the American homeland and the battlefields of the Pacific and Europe, was not accidental. It was carefully maintained by a government that understood, with clear eyes, that civilian morale was a strategic asset as important as any bomber squadron. The Office of War Information, established in 1942, controlled the flow of news with a precision that would be unrecognizable to modern audiences. Newspapers did not print stories that could damage morale. Radio broadcasters did not editorialize against military decisions. Local officials did not share information that the War Department had classified. The press was not coerced exactly. It was partnered. It was enrolled in the project of winning. And within that partnership, certain truths became inadmissible, not because they were false, because they were inconvenient. The economic structure of rural Oregon amplified this isolation. The timber and ranching communities of Klamath County were not connected to the war's information networks in any meaningful way. They received filtered news days after it happened. They trusted their government with a directness that more urban populations had already begun to qualify. When the government said nothing was wrong, these communities believed it, not out of naivety, but out of a trust that had been earned over generations of civic life. That trust, in 1944 and 1945, would be used against them.
What was unthinkable in 1944 America was not war. War was thinkable. War was everywhere. What was unthinkable was the violation of the homeland itself. The idea that an enemy could reach across the Pacific and place a weapon in an American forest, in an American field, on American soil, without a single soldier, without a single ship, without a single aircraft crossing American airspace. The psychological contract that held American civilian morale together was built on one foundational assumption: that the oceans protected them, the Atlantic to the east, the Pacific to the west. These were not just bodies of water, they were the architecture of American safety. They were the reason a woman could take children on a Sunday picnic in the Oregon woods in March of 1945 and not think, even for a single moment, that she was walking into a war zone. Japan understood this, not in a general way, in a specific, studied, militarily precise way. The Imperial Japanese Army's 9th Military Technical Research Institute had spent years analyzing American psychology, American geography, and American vulnerability.
They understood that a weapon which violated the homeland's psychological boundary, even a weapon that caused minimal physical damage, could produce a panic disproportionate to its actual destructive capacity. They understood that the fear of the unknown was a force multiplier. A bomb that killed 6 people but made 30 million wonder whether there was a bomb in their backyard was, in certain strategic calculations, more valuable than a bomb that killed 600 people in a place that felt appropriately distant, appropriately military, appropriately not here. The balloon bomb program, codenamed Fugo, meaning roughly fire balloon, was not designed to win the war by force. It was designed to win something more fragile, the belief that Americans were safe in their own country. And in the forests of Oregon, in the silence that the government subsequently imposed, it came closer to succeeding than anyone was permitted to say. His name was Lieutenant General Suiki Kusaba, and he was not a monster in the way that word is usually meant. He did not enjoy cruelty. He did not seek personal power. He was, by the accounts of those who worked under him, a methodical man, precise, quiet, allergic to waste and imprecision in all their forms. He had been born in 1895 in Niigata Prefecture, on the western coast of Japan, in a fishing community where the sea was not a romantic thing, but a working thing, a source of income, a source of danger, a thing you studied and respected because it could kill you if you did not. His father had been a fisherman who died of pneumonia when Kusaba was 11 years old, leaving his mother to raise 4 children on the proceeds of a boat she could not sail herself. Kusaba had watched his mother negotiate, barter, endure, and adapt. He had learned from her example that survival was not a matter of strength. It was a matter of patience and information. You studied the conditions. You waited for the right moment. You used what was available to you. You did not waste. He entered the Imperial Japanese Army at 18 in 1913 and spent the following 3 decades rising through a military culture that rewarded exactly the qualities his childhood had built into him. He was not a battlefield commander. He was an engineer, a man who thought in systems, in mechanisms, in the physics of force and material. By 1942, as Japan's strategic position in the Pacific began its slow, irreversible deterioration, Kusaba had been assigned to the 9th Military Technical Research Institute with a mandate that would have seemed absurd to almost anyone else: develop a weapon that could reach the continental United States from the Japanese home islands, using no aircraft, no ship, and no human operator. Most of his colleagues thought it was impossible. The Pacific Ocean is 6,000 miles wide. No conventional weapon could cross it unassisted. But Kusaba had been studying a phenomenon that Western meteorologists had only recently begun to document: the jet stream, a river of fast-moving air at altitudes between 30 and 40,000 feet that flowed in winter from the Japanese coast directly across the Pacific toward North America at speeds of up to 200 miles per hour. He had read the research papers. He had done the calculations. He understood with the quiet certainty of an engineer who has checked his figures 3 times that a balloon, the right balloon, made of the right material, carrying the right ballast system to maintain altitude automatically, could ride that jet stream from Japan to America in approximately 3 days. The weapon he designed was, in its way, a masterpiece of engineering minimalism. The balloon itself was made of washi paper, traditional Japanese paper, produced from the fibers of the kozo plant, laminated in layers and sealed with a paste made from konyaku, a root vegetable. It was 60 feet in diameter when fully inflated, capable of lifting a payload of 1,000 pounds. The ballast system was automatic, a series of sandbags hung from the balloon's equator, connected to an altimeter that would drop a bag whenever the balloon fell below 30,000 feet, maintaining altitude through the day-night temperature cycle that would otherwise cause the hydrogen gas to contract and fall. And the payload, the reason for all of it, was an incendiary bomb cluster designed to start forest fires across the Pacific Northwest, and a single anti-personnel fragmentation bomb designed for anyone unlucky enough to find it on the ground. The one event that made Kusaba truly commit to this program, the moment that transformed it from an engineering challenge into something with a harder edge, came in April of 1942, when American B-25 bombers under Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle flew from the aircraft carrier Hornet and bombed Tokyo. The Doolittle raid caused minimal physical damage, but it reached something in Japan that nothing had reached before. It reached the interior. It reached the homeland. It reached the place that was supposed to be safe. Kusaba stood in Tokyo 2 days after the raid, looking at the smoke still rising from one of the damaged buildings, and he thought, with the patience and precision that had defined his entire life, not about vengeance. He thought about reciprocity, about returning to America the exact feeling that the Doolittle raid had just deposited in him, the feeling of standing in a place that was supposed to be safe, and understanding, suddenly, that it was not. He went back to his drafting table. He refined his calculations, and he began to build 9,000 balloons.
She had a gap between her 2 front teeth that she had never learned to be self-conscious about. It was the first thing people noticed when she smiled,
and she smiled often enough that most people in Bly, Oregon, considered it the defining feature of her face. Not her dark brown eyes, not the particular way she wore her hair pinned back with 2 tortoiseshell clips she had owned since she was 14, but that gap, that small, bright interruption in an otherwise ordinary smile that made her look, even at 26, like a girl who had not yet decided to be serious about life. She was 5 months pregnant in March of 1945. She wore her husband's wool coat over her own because her own no longer buttoned across the middle. The coat was olive green, several sizes too large, and she had rolled the cuffs back twice so her hands were visible. People who saw her in the weeks before the picnic remembered those details with the involuntary precision that tragedy produces. The coat, the rolled cuffs, the gapped-toothed smile, the way she walked with one hand resting lightly on the side of her stomach, not cradling it exactly, just touching it, the way you touch something you are not yet fully sure is real. Elsie Winters had been born in 1918 in Medford, Oregon, the second of 3 daughters raised by a father who worked the Southern Pacific Railroad line, and a mother who kept a household so organized it functioned, in Elsie's memory, less like a home and more like a well-run institution. Her mother was not cold, she was efficient. There was a difference, though Elsie spent most of her childhood unable to articulate it. Warmth in that household was real but scheduled. Affection was expressed through action rather than language. You knew you were loved because dinner was hot, and the lamp was on when you came home, and your father checked your arithmetic homework without being asked. Love was a system of reliable presences. It was the lamp, it was the hot dinner, it was the homework check. Elsie had absorbed this grammar of love so thoroughly that she reproduced it instinctively in her own adult life. She showed up, she was reliable, she was present. When Archie Mitchell, the new Methodist minister in Bly, had asked her to help organize the church's youth activities in the spring of 1941, she had said yes before he finished the sentence, because saying yes to things that needed doing was the closest thing to a personal philosophy she had ever developed. She married Archie in 1942, 6 months after they met. The marriage was not a grand romance, it was a recognition, the kind that happens between 2 people who have been lonely in the same specific way and suddenly find themselves in the same room. Archie was earnest and bookish and occasionally oblivious to practical realities in the way that certain kinds of intelligent men are oblivious, and Elsie managed these obliviousnesses with a patience that she had inherited directly from her railroad father. She loved him, not with the dizzy, destabilizing love of novels, but with something more durable, a love built from the daily accumulation of small, reliable presences, the lamp, the hot dinner, the hand on the stomach that was not yet fully real. The wound that had shaken Elsie Mitchell was quiet and undramatic, which made it no less a wound. Her younger sister Clara had died in 1936 of a ruptured appendix, not because the appendix could not have been treated, but because her father, trusting a local doctor's initial misdiagnosis, had waited 2 days before taking her to the hospital in Medford. 2 days. The doctor had said it was stomach flu. Her father had believed him because he was a man who trusted institutions, who trusted the people in authority, who believed that the systems designed to protect people generally did. Clara was 17. She died on a Tuesday morning in August, in a hospital bed, holding Elsie's hand, saying that her stomach didn't hurt anymore, which the nurse told them quietly was not a good sign. Elsie had held her sister's hand through the moment it stopped being held back, and she had walked out of that hospital with a knowledge she had not possessed when she walked in, that institutions failed, that authority was fallible, that the people in charge of protecting you could be wrong, and their wrongness could cost you everything, and they would move on to their next patient and their next misdiagnosis, while you carried the weight of their mistake for the rest of your life. She had never spoken this belief out loud, not to Archie, not to her mother, not to anyone. It lived in her silently, a counterweight to her outward reliability, a private skepticism that occasionally surfaced as a slight hesitation before she accepted official explanations of anything. It was the morally gray thing about Elsie Mitchell, this hidden distrust, this quiet refusal to fully believe what she was told, which coexisted uneasily with the absolute trust she placed in her own physical instincts, her own direct experience of the world. She trusted what she could touch, she trusted what she could see, and on that Sunday morning in March of 1945, when she saw something half buried in the snow at the edge of Gearhart Mountain, her instinct was not to call for Archie. Her instinct was to reach down and touch it herself, because that was how she had always verified the truth of things, with her hands, with direct contact, with the absolute, unmediated authority of her own experience. It was the last instinct she ever acted on.
He was 31 years old, and walked with a slight drag in his left foot that was not a limp exactly, but was the kind of irregularity in a person's gait that, once you noticed it, you could not stop noticing. He had been a signals intelligence analyst with the Army's Military Intelligence Service, stationed in San Francisco, before a car accident in January of 1944
left him with nerve damage in his left leg that was sufficient to remove him from active field duty, but insufficient, in the Army's calculation, to warrant a full medical discharge. He had been reassigned to the Western Defense Command's Domestic Surveillance Division, a posting that sounded on paper like a demotion and functioned in practice as something considerably more consequential. Richard Cole was the man whose job it was to collect, analyze, and report on every anomalous object recovered from the forests, fields, and coastlines of the American West. He was, in the specific language of his reassignment paperwork, a debris analyst. He preferred to think of himself privately as the only person in the United States government who was paying attention to the right things. He had grown up in Portland, Oregon, the only child of a Japanese-American mother and an Irish-American father who had met at a cannery in Astoria in 1911 and built a life together that required, in the social climate of the Pacific Northwest in the early 20th century, a particular kind of daily courage that neither of them ever discussed and both of them constantly practiced. His mother, Kamiko Cole, had come to Oregon from Kyoto at the age of 19, sponsored by a distant cousin who worked the fishing boats out of Astoria. She was a small woman with very precise hands and a habit of explaining things through analogy. She did not tell you what something was, she told you what it was like, and the comparison was always so exact that the original thing suddenly became permanently clearer. Richard had inherited her hands and her habit of analogy, and both had served him well in intelligence work, where the central problem was almost always the same. You had a fragment, and you needed to understand what whole it had broken off from. The wound in Richard Cole's life was not singular. It was ongoing, and it had been ongoing since February 19, 1942, when President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, and the United States government began forcibly relocating Japanese Americans from the West Coast to inland internment camps. His mother had been 61 years old. She had lived in America for 42 years. She had raised her son, buried her husband, paid her taxes, grown her garden, attended her Methodist church, and constructed a life of such ordinary American completeness that the order, when it came, felt to Richard not merely unjust, but cosmically incoherent, a sentence that did not parse, a fact that refused to be absorbed. He had used his position in military intelligence to keep his mother out of the camps through a series of petitions and formal requests that had cost him 2 promotions and the lasting suspicion of his commanding officer. He had succeeded. His mother still lived in her house in Portland, and the cost of that success, the knowledge of what he had been willing to do, the corners he had cut, the information he had withheld from certain reports in exchange for certain considerations, lived in him as a permanent moral bruise, tender to the touch, never quite healed. What Richard Cole and Elsie Mitchell shared, though they would not meet until the spring of 1945, was a relationship with official silence that had been formed by personal loss. Elsie had lost her sister to a doctor's confident wrongness. Richard had nearly lost his mother to a government's systematic wrongness. Both of them had learned at cost that the institutions which claimed to protect people were capable of failing them completely, and that the failure was rarely announced. It was usually maintained carefully, in the language of reassurance. Everything is fine. There is nothing to worry about. We have the situation under control. The most dangerous words in any language, Richard Cole had come to believe, were not threats. They were these quiet assurances, these smoothly delivered nothings, these official silences. He had been tracking the balloon bomb debris reports for 8 months before he found Elsie Mitchell's name in a casualty report so heavily redacted that even her pregnancy had been removed from the official record, as though acknowledging it would make the story too human to suppress. He read that redacted report in his office in San Francisco on a Tuesday evening in April of 1945, and he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel since he had read the text of Executive Order 9066. A clear, cold, unambiguous anger, the kind that does not look for expression, but settles instead into the body as determination, as purpose, as the quiet decision that something is going to be done. The moment their goals aligned was not dramatic. It did not happen in a single conversation. It happened slowly, across 3 weeks of letters and one face-to-face meeting in a diner in Klamath Falls in May of 1945, where Richard Cole slid a manila folder across a linoleum table toward a woman in an olive green coat that was too large for her,
a woman whose husband had told him she hadn't smiled since March, hadn't touched the tortoiseshell hair clips, hadn't put her hand on her stomach in the way she used to, and said quietly that he thought she deserved to know what the government had known, and when they had known it, and what they had decided to do with that knowledge. He said he thought she was the right person to help him make sure they could not keep making that decision indefinitely. She looked at him across the linoleum table for a long moment, long enough that he became uncertain, and then she said with the flatness of someone who has already done their grieving and arrived on the other side of it at something harder. "I know. I've known since April. Tell me what you need from me."
The diner was called Pauline's, and it sat on the eastern edge of Klamath Falls like something that had been placed there temporarily and then forgotten. It had 6 booths, a counter with 8 stools, a pie case that always contained exactly 2 varieties regardless of the season, and a proprietor named Pauline Drucker who had been running the place since 1931 and had developed over those 14 years a refined indifference to the private conversations of her customers that made her, without her knowledge, the ideal host for the kind of meeting that Richard Cole had driven 312 miles to conduct. He arrived 40 minutes early. He ordered coffee he did not drink. He arranged and rearranged the manila folder on the table in front of him with the nervous precision of a man who has rehearsed a conversation so many times that the rehearsal has begun to feel more real than the conversation itself. Elsie arrived exactly on time, which told him something. People who arrive exactly on time to difficult meetings are people who have decided, before they leave the house, how they are going to conduct themselves. They have made their internal preparations. They are not going to be surprised into emotion. She slid into the booth across from him without removing the olive green coat, ordered coffee from Pauline without looking at the menu, and looked at Richard Cole with the direct, assessing steadiness of someone taking inventory. He noticed, in the way that intelligence analysts notice things involuntarily, that she was not wearing the tortoiseshell hair clips. Her hair was pinned back with a single plain clip, the functional kind, the kind that communicates nothing about the person wearing it. He understood without being told that this was intentional. She had put away the things that belonged to who she had been before March. "You said in your letter that you had documents," she said. "Not hello, not thank you for coming. Documents." "I do," he said. "Documents that show the government knew about the balloons before March 9th. Before November of 1944, he said. We had the first confirmed debris recovery in November. The first internal memo acknowledging the program as Japanese in origin was dated December 14th, 1944. The decision to suppress press coverage was made in January of 1945. The directive went to every major newspaper, every radio network, every regional office of War Information Field Office. It was comprehensive. It was deliberate. And it was in place 2 full months before your husband took those children into the woods. The silence that followed was not empty. It was load-bearing. Elsie Mitchell looked at the table, then at the pie case, then back at Richard Cole with an expression he could not fully categorize. It was not grief, because grief had a softness to it, and this had no softness at all. It was something closer to the expression of a person who has been handed confirmation of something they already knew, and the confirmation has not relieved them, but has instead removed their last reason to hope they were wrong. "Who made the decision?" she said. It was not phrased as a question. "That's what I need your help to find out," Richard said. And across the linoleum table, across the untouched coffees and the manila folder, and the careful distance of 2 people who did not yet trust each other, the alliance that would spend the next 4 months dismantling a government suppression operation was born, not in solidarity, not in shared grief, but in the specific, focused anger of 2 people who had each, in their own way, been failed by official silence, and had decided, separately and now together, that the silence was going to end. The first test came 11 days after the diner meeting, and Elsie administered it without telling Richard she was doing so. She had written, in a letter to Richard's San Francisco office, that she had found something, a fragment of washi paper recovered from the blast site that she had kept without reporting, concealed in the lining of the olive green coat, taken from the snow before the military recovery team had arrived and catalogued everything that remained. She wrote that she was willing to share it if he could tell her something that was not in any official report, something specific enough that she would know he had genuine access, and was not simply a more sophisticated version of the official machinery she was already fighting. She was testing him.
If he responded with generalities, with reassurances, with the smooth, institutional language she had learned to distrust, she would know he was not what he claimed to be. Richard's response arrived 4 days later. It was 2 pages long, and it contained the following information: that the balloon recovered nearest to the Bly blast site had carried a serial number stamped on its ballast ring, that this number had been traced by military intelligence to a specific production facility in Tokyo, that the facility was staffed primarily by Japanese schoolgirls between the ages of 13 and 18, who had been conscripted into the balloon manufacturing program under a national mobilization directive, and that these girls had been told they were making weather balloons for meteorological research. They did not know what the balloons carried. They did not know where they were going. Some of them, Richard wrote, had tucked small folded paper cranes into the seams of the ballast components, a private gesture of craftsmanship or prayer or something that did not have a name, and several of these cranes had survived the 6,000-mile journey and the landing, and had been recovered from American forest floors, small and precise and utterly incongruous, folded by the hands of teenage girls in Tokyo, and opened by military analysts in Oregon who did not know what to make of them, and so had filed them under miscellaneous recovered materials and moved on. Elsie read this letter 3 times. Then she removed the washi paper fragment from the lining of the olive green coat and mailed it to San Francisco in a plain envelope with no return address. The second moment of trust came in late May, when Richard revealed a dangerous truth that he had not included in any of his official reports. He had known since February of 1945 that at least 2 additional balloon landings had occurred within 20 miles of Bly prior to the March 9th explosion, one in late January, one in mid-February, and both landings had been investigated and cleared by Army recovery teams who had marked the sites as secure. The bomb that killed Elsie Mitchell and the 5 children had not been a first arrival. It had been waiting. The area had already been visited. The recovery teams had found the balloons but had missed the ordnance, or had catalogued it as inert, or had made some procedural error in their sweep that had left a live fragmentation device buried in the snow of Gerhardt Mountain for weeks before a pregnant woman and 5 children walked within arm's reach of it. The Army knew this. It was in the internal reports. It had been classified at the highest available level, and was not, as far as Richard could determine, ever going to be declassified in either of their lifetimes. He told her this in person, in a second meeting, this time in a park in Portland where his mother's rose garden was just beginning to show its first tentative spring color. He told her quietly, without preamble, because he had learned in 11 years of intelligence work that there was no kind way to deliver this category of information, and that the attempt to be kind usually produced something worse than directness. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "They left it there. They knew it was in the area and they left it there." And Richard said, "I believe so, yes." And she said, "And no one is going to answer for that." And he said, carefully, "Not through official channels, no." The third moment came in early June, and it was Richard who was saved from exposure. He had obtained, through a contact in the War Department's Records Division, a set of internal communications documenting the January 1945 Press Suppression Directive, the specific orders that had gone out to newspapers and radio stations, instructing them to report nothing about balloon bomb landings. He had these documents in a briefcase. He was carrying the briefcase on a streetcar in San Francisco when he recognized, in the seat 2 rows ahead of him, a man named Douglas Firth, a counterintelligence officer he knew from his own division, a man whose specific function was to identify and neutralize information leaks within the Western Defense Command. Firth had not seen him. Richard had 15 seconds to decide what to do. He stood up, left the briefcase under his seat, stepped off the streetcar at the next stop, and walked 4 blocks in the wrong direction before circling back. The briefcase was gone when he returned, taken by Firth or by chance, or by some ordinary San Francisco civilian who had wanted a free briefcase. He never knew. But the documents were gone, and with them went weeks of work, and he stood on that street corner in the fog with nothing in his hands and the very clear understanding that someone in his own division was watching him. He telephoned Elsie that evening from a payphone outside a hardware store in the Tenderloin. He told her what had happened. He told her he thought he was being monitored. He told her they needed to move faster than he had planned. There was a silence on the line, the particular silence of a telephone connection across 300 miles of wire in 1945, with its faint electrical hiss and its sense of distance. And then Elsie said, "How fast?" And Richard said, "Weeks, not months." And she said, "Then tell me the plan."
He told her the plan. But first, because he had decided that she deserved to know exactly who she was working with, he told her something else. In the spring of 1943, Richard Cole had been part of a military intelligence team tasked with evaluating the loyalty of Japanese-American men being considered for service in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The evaluation process involved interviews, background checks, and a series of written questionnaires that had been designed with bureaucratic thoroughness
to be essentially unanswerable without incriminating yourself. The most notorious question was number 28. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? And question 27, which preceded it. Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor? Men who answered no to both questions, the no-no boys as they came to be called, were separated, reclassified, and in many cases transferred to the Tule Lake Segregation Center under conditions that Richard, who had read the internal assessments, knew were considerably harsher than the official descriptions acknowledged. Richard had been responsible for writing the loyalty assessments of 43 men. 39 of them he had assessed accurately, to the best of his ability and conscience. 4 of them he had assessed strategically, had written assessments that downgraded their loyalty classifications not on evidence, but on their utility to him. These 4 men had information he needed, about conditions inside specific internment facilities, about the treatment of elderly Japanese American women, about the particular facility where his mother might have been sent if his petitions had failed. He had traded favorable information for unfavorable assessments. He had, in the specific language of what he had done, falsified government documents to protect his mother, and the cost of that protection had been paid by 4 men he had never met, who were transferred to Tule Lake based on his false reports, where they spent 14 months in conditions that he did not want to describe in detail, but would, because Elsie had asked him to be honest, and he had decided he was going to be. He finished speaking. The electrical hiss of the telephone line filled the silence. Then Elsie said, "Did any of them die?" And Richard said, "One of them did. A man named Hiroshi Tanaka, 44 years old, from Sacramento. Pneumonia. December of 1943. And Elsie said nothing for a long time. And then she said, "I'm not going to tell you that was acceptable." And Richard said, "I know." And she said, "But I'm also not going to pretend it changes what we're doing." And he understood in that moment that this was why she was the right person, not because she forgave him, but because she did not need to forgive him to work alongside him, and that distinction, morally uncomfortable as it was exactly the kind of clarity the situation required. What they were going to do was simultaneously simple and irreversible. Richard had identified 3 key individuals whose documented knowledge of the balloon bomb program and the press suppression directive made them the load-bearing pillars of the cover-up. The first was Colonel Harold Vance Strickland, the Western Defense Command officer who had drafted and distributed the January 1945 suppression directive. The second was a civilian named Peter Aldous Mercer, the regional OWI field director who had personally visited newspaper editors in Oregon, Washington, and Northern California to ensure compliance. The third was a records administrator named Gerald Foote, who maintained the classified archive in which the pre-March debris reports and the Army Recovery Team's sweep assessments were stored, the documents that proved the bomb site had been visited and cleared as recently as February 14th, less than 3 weeks before Elsie touched the wire. Their plan was not violence. It was something in certain ways more dangerous than violence. It was documentation and distribution, a coordinated effort to copy, authenticate, and deliver the classified materials to journalists operating outside the domestic press suppression network, specifically to 2 foreign correspondents, 1 British, 1 Canadian, whose publications were not subject to the OWI directive, and who had, Richard knew from his intelligence contacts, been quietly trying to piece together the balloon bomb story for months without sufficient sourcing. The plan would give them the sourcing. The plan would break the story in London and Toronto before any American official could suppress it, and once it was in foreign print, the American press would have cover to follow. What could go wrong? And Richard planted these seeds deliberately, because he had spent 11 years in intelligence learning that unacknowledged risks were the ones that killed you, was this. First, Douglas Firth was watching him, which meant the window for accessing Gerald Foote's records archive was narrower than he had planned, and the margin for error in the extraction was close to 0. And second, Elsie Mitchell was a recently bereaved woman whose husband was a minister in a small Oregon town, which meant that her involvement, if discovered, would be framed not as whistleblowing, but as the unstable, grief-driven actions of a woman who had lost her mind along with her child. The government would not need to discredit the documents if it could discredit her. And it had, Richard knew with the cold clarity of someone who had worked inside the machine,
both the motivation and the capability to do exactly.
They began on the 14th of June, 1945, a Thursday, which Richard had chosen because Thursday was the day Gerald Foote's records archive operated with a skeleton staff, 2 clerks instead of the usual 5, a shift supervisor who took a 40-minute lunch at the commissary across the street at 12:15 without variation, and a filing rotation that placed the specific classified drawer they needed in the accessible outer room rather than the secured inner vault where it lived for the other 4 days of the week. Richard had established this pattern over 6 weeks of observation, conducted with the methodical patience of a man who had learned from his mother that the correct preparation time for any difficult action was always longer than you initially estimated. He had mapped the archive's rhythms the way his mother had mapped the tides outside her cousin's fishing dock in Astoria, not because the information was interesting, but because your survival depended on knowing exactly when the water was going to move and in which direction. Elsie's role in the first phase was not physical, it was epistolary. She had spent the 2 weeks prior composing 4 letters, each addressed to a different person, each written in a different register, one to Archie, one to her mother, one to a woman named Helen Garrett, who was her closest friend in Bly, and one to a post office box in Portland that belonged to a network Richard had established for exactly this kind of contingency communication. The letters to Archie, her mother, and Helen were covers, ordinary correspondence, the kind of letters a grieving woman might write to the people closest to her, letters that established her presence in Bly, her emotional state, her daily routine. The letter to the Portland post office box contained the authentication codes Richard had given her and the names of the 2 foreign correspondents, encoded in a method so elementary, a simple substitution cipher using the names of Oregon counties as the key, that it would have embarrassed a professional cryptographer and been completely invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. The archive extraction went, in its first phase, precisely as planned. Richard entered the Western Defense Command Records Building at 11:53, signed in under a cover identity that his counterintelligence experience had taught him to maintain with compulsive thoroughness, and located the classified drawer in the outer room within 4 minutes. The documents he needed, the pre-November debris reports, the December identification memo, and most critically, the February 14th sweep assessment from Gearhart Mountain, were exactly where Foote's filing system predicted they would be. He photographed them with a Minox sub-miniature camera that he carried in his shirt pocket, replaced them with the care of a man returning borrowed books, and was back in the corridor before the shift supervisor returned from the commissary. The thing that went wrong was minor, in the way that minor things go wrong before they become the reason everything falls apart. As he signed out at the security desk, the clerk, a young corporal named Dennis Hartwell, who Richard had never seen at this post before, looked at his sign-in entry, looked at Richard, and said with the apologetic efficiency of someone following a new protocol, "Sir, we've had a new directive on visitor logging. I need a secondary identification in addition to the standard pass." Richard produced a second document without hesitation because he had 3 levels of cover identity and had prepared for exactly this kind of procedural obstacle. The corporal examined it, stamped the log, and waved him through. It was over in 45 seconds. But as Richard walked down the front steps of the building into the San Francisco afternoon fog, he felt the specific unease of a man who has just encountered an unexpected variable in a system he thought he understood completely. Someone had issued a new logging directive. Someone had decided recently that visitor records at this particular building needed to be more thorough. He did not know if this was routine administrative tightening or something more targeted. He did not know if the corporal named Dennis Hartwell was simply a new clerk or something else entirely. He filed the uncertainty in the part of his mind reserved for things that required watching, and he walked to the payphone outside the hardware store in the Tenderloin, and he called Elsie, and he told her, "First phase complete. Second phase begins Monday." He did not mention Dennis Hartwell. He told himself this was because it was probably nothing. He would understand later that this was the first of 2 seeds of doubt he had planted in his own plan, and then chosen, for reasons that were more emotional than strategic, not to water. The second phase was supposed to be delivery, the transfer of the photographed documents to the British correspondent, a man named Edmund Reese Halloway, who was based in a residential hotel on Powell Street and had been waiting with the disciplined patience of a Fleet Street veteran for the sourcing that would allow him to file the story his editors had been requesting since February. Richard had met Halloway twice before, briefly, through a mutual contact in the British consulate.
He trusted him in the limited, calibrated way that intelligence professionals trust journalists, which is to say he trusted his interest in the story and his professional commitment to protecting his sources, and he trusted nothing else. He arrived at Holloway's hotel on Monday, the 18th of June at 2 in the afternoon, went to the third floor, knocked twice on room 312, and waited. Holloway opened the door and let him in without speaking, which was the agreed protocol. But as Richard entered the room, he saw immediately that something was different. There were papers spread across the small desk by the window, not Holloway's notes, which Richard had seen before, and recognized by their precise British handwriting and their systematic organization, but something else. Printed documents, typed. Richard recognized the format before he recognized the content, because the format was one he had spent 11 years producing. It was an American military intelligence report. Holloway saw Richard's expression and said quietly, "I was going to tell you. These arrived this morning. Someone else has been feeding me material. I don't know who." Richard crossed the room and read the documents on the desk. What he found there was not what he had expected to find, and what he had expected to find was already, by any ordinary measure, extraordinary. The documents were not simply about the balloon bomb program. They were about what the balloon bomb program had been intended to precede. There was, in the classified record that Holloway's anonymous source had delivered, a secondary operation, designated in the documents as Operation Willow-Wind, that had been planned for the winter of 1945 and 1946, contingent on the success of Fugo as a psychological destabilization program. Willow-Wind was not a balloon operation, it was a biological one. The plan, developed jointly by the Imperial Japanese Army's Unit 731 and the Balloon Weapons Division, called for a second wave of balloon launches carrying ceramic canisters containing plague bacillus and anthrax spores, targeted specifically at the agricultural regions of the Pacific Northwest, designed not to kill people directly, but to contaminate the grain fields and livestock ranges that supplied a significant portion of the American military's food production chain. The plan had been shelved in March of 1945, when Japan's deteriorating strategic position made the logistics of the biological payload production impossible to sustain. But it had been real, it had been operational, it had reached the stage of field testing, and somewhere in the classified archives of the Western Defense Command, in drawers that Richard had not photographed, in a secured inner vault he had not accessed, there were documents describing the test results. Richard stood at the desk in Holloway's intel room, reading these pages, and felt something he had not felt since the streetcar incident with Douglas Firth, a genuine physical cold that had nothing to do with the San Francisco fog. They had not been uncovering a story about bureaucratic suppression and civilian casualties. They had been standing at the visible edge of something vastly larger, and they had not known it. The press suppression directive, the classified debris reports, the February sweep assessment, these were not the cover-up. These were the cover for the cover-up. The thing that was truly being hidden was the biological operation, the evidence of what Japan had been willing to do, and what American military intelligence had known about, and classified so deeply that even a decorated signals analyst with full Western Defense Command credentials had not been able to see it. He sat down on the edge of Holloway's bed and looked at the floor for a long moment. Then he picked up the telephone and called Elsie and Bly, and he told her that the plan had changed, and that what they were doing with was larger than either of them had understood, and that she needed to decide right now, before they went any further, whether she still wanted to be part of this. There was the electrical hiss of the line. There was the particular silence of 300 miles of wire. And then Elsie Mitchell said, "I'm already part of this. Tell me what you found."
The first death was Colonel Harold Vance Strickland, and it was shocking because it was not murder. Strickland was 53 years old, a career Army officer with the specific combination of competence and moral flexibility that tends to produce men who draft press suppression directives without losing sleep over them. He was not a villain in his own understanding of himself. He was a pragmatist. He had signed the January suppression directive because his commanding general had told him to, and his commanding general had told him to because the War Department had assessed, correctly in strictly military terms, that public knowledge of the balloon bomb program would produce a civilian panic disproportionate to the program's actual destructive capacity, and that civilian panic was a strategic liability the Army could not afford in January of 1945, with two major Pacific operations still in the planning phase. Strickland had agreed with this assessment. He had signed the directive. He had not thought about Elsie Mitchell or the children in the woods, because Elsie Mitchell and the children in the woods did not yet exist as a fact. They were, in January of 1945, a future he had not imagined and had not been asked to prevent. He died on the evening of June 22, 1945, at his desk in the Western Defense Command headquarters, of a cerebral hemorrhage so sudden and so complete that the clerk who found him the following morning initially assumed he had fallen asleep over his paperwork. He was found with a pen in his hand and an unfinished sentence on the document in front of him. The sentence read,
In accordance with the directive of January 14th, it is my recommendation that the following materials be transferred to, and then it stopped, mid-clause, because Strickland's brain had stopped first. He had been under elevated stress for 3 weeks, his physicians would note in the post-mortem. He had been working 16-hour days. He had, in the week before his death, received 3 separate internal memoranda flagging anomalies in the Western Defense Command's visitor logs. He had been, in other words, aware that something was moving toward him, and the awareness had been killing him in the most ordinary way imaginable, quietly, biologically, from the inside, through the cumulative physiological cost of sustained high-level fear. Richard learned of Strickland's death from a contact in the WDC administrative office on the morning of June 23rd. He sat with the information for a long time. It was not justice. It was not anything he had planned or sought. It was the accidental, impersonal elimination of a man whose institutional function had cost 6 people their lives by the same impersonal biological processes that had eliminated Elsie Mitchell's sister in a hospital bed in Medford in 1936. The randomness of it was, in its own way, more disturbing than anything deliberate could have been. The second death was calculated, and Richard Cole calculated it. Peter Aldous Mercer, the OWI Regional Field Director, who had personally visited newspaper editors across Oregon and California to enforce the suppression directive, was not a military officer and was not subject to military oversight. He was a civilian administrator, which meant that his exposure in the foreign press, once Holloway filed his story, would be professional and reputational rather than legal. It would end his career. It would not, in all probability, result in criminal charges. Richard knew this, and he knew that Mercer also knew this, and he knew that Mercer had spent the past several weeks quietly preparing for exactly this outcome, assembling character witnesses, establishing plausible deniability, positioning himself as a mid-level functionary who had simply followed orders from above. He was not wrong that this strategy would work. It would work completely. He would survive the story, absorb the institutional consequence, and eventually, in some quieter government posting in some less visible city, reconstruct something like a career. Richard made a single telephone call to a woman named Margaret Owens, a reporter at a Portland newspaper, who had been one of the editors personally visited by Mercer in January, and who had been sitting on a specific piece of information about Mercer's pre-war civilian career, a financial fraud case in Sacramento in 1938, that had been settled quietly, expunged from the public record through a connection Mercer had in the California Attorney General's office, and buried thoroughly enough that it had never surfaced in any of his government background checks. Richard had found it in January, in a records search he had conducted for unrelated reasons, and had filed it in the part of his mind reserved for potential future utility. He told Margaret Owens where to look. He gave her the Sacramento case number. He told her to be careful. She published the story 4 days later, and Peter Aldous Mercer resigned from federal service on the morning of June 28, 1945, before the story had finished its first news cycle. He was dead within the year. Not from the story, not from anything Richard had done, but from a stomach cancer that had been developing for 2 years, and that he had not sought treatment for because he had been too occupied with his own institutional survival to attend to his body's quiet emergency. Another impersonal biological reckoning. Another death that felt in its specific timing like something other than coincidence, though it was almost certainly nothing else. The third death was the most disturbing, and it was the most disturbing because it was the most deliberate, and the most deliberate because Richard Cole had decided, in a moment of cold clarity that he would spend the rest of his life examining, that Gerald Foote could not be allowed to reach the classified inner vault before Holloway filed his story. Gerald Foote was not a bad man. This was the thing that made it most disturbing. He was a 38-year-old records administrator from Sacramento who liked jazz and kept a photograph of his wife and 2 daughters on his desk and brought homemade sandwiches to work in a brown paper bag and had been maintaining the Western Defense Command's classified archives since 1943 with the conscientious thoroughness of a man who genuinely believed that his work mattered. He believed in the archive. He believed in the integrity of the record. When he had filed the February 14th sweep assessment from Gerhardt Mountain under its classified designation, he had done so because those were his instructions, not because he had any awareness of what the document meant, or who would eventually die because of what it concealed. He was not protecting a cover-up. He was doing his job. Richard arranged for Gerald Foote to be investigated. He used a contact in the Army's Inspector General's office to flag a series of minor archival discrepancies, missing file numbers, unsigned transfer receipts, small procedural irregularities that Foote had accumulated over 2 years of high-volume records management, and that were individually meaningless but collectively sufficient, in the language of an Inspector General inquiry, to constitute a pattern requiring investigation. The investigation was opened on June 25th. Foote was placed on administrative leave pending review on June 26th.
He was removed from access to the classified archive on June 27th. He was not charged with anything. He was not fired. He was simply moved, temporarily, out of the position from which he could have reached the inner vault, and transferred or destroyed the Willowwind documents before Holloway's story ran. The investigation was eventually closed without findings. Foote returned to his position in September of 1945. He never knew why he had been investigated. He spent the rest of his career in a state of low-grade institutional anxiety, never fully certain of his standing, never entirely sure that the ground beneath him was solid. And this anxiety, this permanent, sourceless unease, was the thing Richard Cole had given him in exchange for 48 hours of archive access, and it was a thing that could not be returned or undone or apologized for. The call came at 7 in the morning on June 28th, and it was not from Holloway. It was from Dennis Hartwell. The corporal who had asked for secondary identification at the records building sign-in desk was not, as Richard had told himself on the afternoon of June 14th, simply a new clerk. He was a counterintelligence asset. He had been placed at the security desk specifically because Douglas Firth had identified Richard Cole as a probable leak source in May, and tracked his movements to the records building, and had arranged for the new logging directive specifically to capture the secondary identification that Richard had produced, a document that, when cross-referenced with the visitor log, established beyond reasonable question that Richard Cole had been in the outer archive room on the day that specific classified documents had been accessed, and the name he had signed in under was not his own. Hartwell told him this on the telephone in the flat, almost apologetic tone of a young man delivering bad news he has been instructed to deliver. He said, "Sir, I need you to understand that there is a file with your name on it that is currently on Colonel Firth's desk." He said, "I'm telling you because I think what you're doing is right and I think you deserve to know." He said, "You have maybe 6 hours before they move." Richard Cole stood in his apartment in San Francisco with the telephone receiver in his hand, and the morning fog pressing against his window, and the full weight of what he had built settling onto it at once. The documents, the foreign correspondence, the Inspector General inquiry, the 4 false loyalty assessments, the one dead man named Hiroshi Tanaka, the woman in the olive green coat and Bly, the gap in her teeth that no one had seen her smile with since March, all of it balancing on the 6 hours that Dennis Hartwell had just given him, and the question of whether 6 hours was enough to do what needed to be done before Colonel Douglas Firth.
What you call a cover-up, I call architecture. You have to understand something about the way information works in a time of war. Because most people, most civilians, most grieving wives, most idealistic signals analysts who think their conscience is a compass, do not understand it and have never been asked to. Information is not neutral. It is not a river that flows where it will and finds its own level and causes no harm. Information is a load-bearing element of a structure. It holds things up. And when you remove a load-bearing element from a structure, even if you remove it for righteous reasons, even if you remove it because the element was placed there unjustly, even if you are absolutely correct about the injustice, the structure does not pause to acknowledge your righteousness. It falls, and everything inside it falls with it. I signed my name to things in the winter of 1945 that I will not apologize for. The suppression directive, the classification levels, the internal communications that told newspaper editors and radio broadcasters and local officials across the Pacific Northwest to say nothing about objects falling from the sky and their forests and their fields. I signed my name to these things not because I was following orders. That is the answer of a man who has outsourced his conscience, and I have never outsourced mine. But because I had read the projections. I had sat in rooms with men who understood mass psychology in the way that engineers understand structural load, and I had listened to what they told me would happen if the American public learned in January of 1945 that Japan had developed a weapon capable of reaching the continental United States. Not a theoretical weapon, not a rumored weapon, a weapon that was landing, that had been landing since November, that had already been recovered from the forests of Montana and the wheat fields of Iowa and the coastal headlands of Oregon, a weapon that was, in the most precise and literal sense, already here. The projections said panic, not the manageable, productive fear that makes people buy war bonds and plant victory gardens and accept rationing with grim civic cheerfulness, the other kind, the kind that moves through a population the way a current moves through water, not in a straight line, not predictably, but finding every available path, following every weakness, filling every space. The projections said civilian work stoppages in the Pacific Northwest timber and agricultural sectors. They said pressure on the War Department to redirect bomber squadrons from Pacific offensive operations to domestic defense patrols, bomber squadrons that were, in January of 1945, in the final planning stages for operations that would end the war. They said political pressure on the administration to negotiate, to pause, to hesitate,
at the precise moment when hesitation was the one thing that could not be afforded. And they said most specifically and most chillingly that if the biological component of the balloon program were to become public knowledge, and in January of 1945 we had already recovered sufficient evidence to know that the biological component existed, even if we did not yet know its full scope, the panic would not be manageable at any level. It would be civilizational. So I made a decision. It was not a comfortable decision. I am not going to tell you it was comfortable. I am not going to tell you that I slept easily in January and February of 1945, because I did not, and the people who make these decisions and then tell you they slept easily are the people you should be most afraid of. I slept badly. I lay awake and I ran the calculations again, and I arrived at the same answer every time, the way you arrive at the same answer to a mathematical problem every time you work it correctly, regardless of how much you dislike the answer. The answer was, the suppression was necessary, the silence was load-bearing. The 6 people in the Oregon woods were, and I am going to use the word that makes you hate me, because it is the accurate word, and I have never been able to bring myself to use an inaccurate word in its place, acceptable. Not acceptable as in pleasant, not acceptable as in deserved, acceptable as in, the structure required a cost, and this was the cost the structure extracted, and I made the calculation that the structure was worth more than the cost. And here is the thing I want you to sit with, because it is the thing that has never left me, not in any room I have occupied since the summer of 1945. I was right. About the panic projections, about the work stoppages, about the bomber squadrons, about the political pressure. I was right about all of it, because none of it happened, because the suppression held, because the silence held, because the structure held, and because the structure held, the war ended in August of 1945 in the manner it ended, and the men who might have died in the operations that civilian panic might have compromised did not die in those operations. I made a calculation. The calculation was correct, and a woman named Elsie Mitchell and 5 children in the woods of Oregon paid the cost of my correct calculation. And I have been living in that sentence for every day of my life since, and I will live in it for every day remaining to me, and I will not apologize for the decision, and I will never stop baying for it, and both of those things are true simultaneously, and the simultaneity of them is the most honest thing I have ever said about anything. There is one more thing. One thing I have told no one. On the morning of February 15, 1945, I received the sweep assessment report from the Army recovery team that had cleared the area around Gearhart Mountain. I read it at my desk. I noted the team's finding that the balloon debris had been recovered, and the area had been marked as clear. And I noted in the margin of the report in my own handwriting a question, confirm ordnance inert? And beneath my question, in the handwriting of the officer who had processed the report before passing it to me, was a single word, confirmed. I accepted that confirmation. I filed the report. I did not send anyone back to verify. I accepted the word of a man I had never met about the condition of a bomb in a forest I had never visited, because I had 40 other reports on my desk that morning, and because the confirmation was there in writing, and because I was tired, and because the structure needed to hold, and I needed to believe it was holding. And 22 days later, Elsie Mitchell put her hand on a wire in the snow of Gearhart Mountain, and the confirmation I had accepted without verification announced itself for what it had always been, a word on a piece of paper, written by a man who had made his own calculation, accepted by a man who had made his own calculation, and paid for, as all such calculations are eventually paid for, by someone who had made no calculation at all, someone who had simply walked into the woods on a Sunday morning and trusted that the world she moved through was as safe as the people responsible for its safety had promised it was. I knew her name. I had read it in the casualty report. I read it every night before I went to sleep in January and February and March of 1946, not as penance. Penance implies a belief in absolution, and I have no such belief, but as accounting, as the accurate maintenance of the ledger. Her name was Elsie Mitchell. She had a gap between her front teeth. She was 26 years old. She was 5 months pregnant. She had rolled back the cuffs of her husband's coat so her hands were visible, and I had confirmed the ordnance inert, and it was not, and she had put her hands on it, and that is the sentence I live in. That is the architecture of my particular silence. Not the official silence, which I still believe was necessary, the private one, the one that has no justification and requires none, because it is not a policy, it is simply what I carry. It is simply what it costs to be the kind of man who makes the calculations that keep the structure standing. You pay with your sleep. You pay with the specific quality of silence that fills a room when you stop talking. You pay with the knowledge that somewhere, in a forest you will never visit, there is a place in the snow where the cost of your correct answer is permanently physically recorded in the earth, and the earth does not care that you were right. The earth only knows what happened.
Richard Cole had 6 hours. He used 4 of them. He telephoned Edmund Reese Halloway at 7:22 and told him to file immediately. Not the version they had planned, the careful, sourced, legally vetted version that Halloway had been refining for 2 weeks, but the raw version, the documented version, for the final edit. File it dirty and let the editors clean it in London. Halloway, who was a Fleet Street veteran and understood the specific urgency in Richard's voice as fluently as a doctor understands a patient's breathing, said, "It'll be on the wire in 40 minutes." And it was. Richard then called Elsie. He told her that the story was filing. He told her that within 24 hours her name would be in every newspaper in Britain and Canada, and once the American press found its cover in every newspaper in the United States. He told her that she needed to be prepared for what came next. Not threats, not legal action, because the government's options for suppressing a story already on the international wire were limited, but the slower, more personal kind of institutional pressure, the visits, the interviews, the gentle and then less gentle suggestions that her grief had led her to be used by people with agendas she did not fully understand. He told her that they would try to make her the story instead of the story being the story. He told her to say nothing to anyone until she had spoken to a lawyer. She told him she had already spoken to a lawyer. She had spoken to a lawyer in Portland 3 weeks ago because she had learned from the experience of watching her father trust an institution until it was too late that you prepared for the moment before the moment arrived. He told her she was the most prepared person he had ever worked with. She said, "I had good teachers." He understood she was not talking about him. Douglas Firth arrived at Richard's apartment building at 11:43 with 2 counterintelligence officers and a warrant that was, by the time it was executed, approximately 4 hours too late to accomplish its primary purpose. The story was on the wire. The documents were authenticated and in the hands of foreign press. The Willow Wind documents, which Richard had photographed from Holloway's anonymous source copies and mailed to 3 separate locations the previous evening, were already in transit. Firth knew this by the time he reached the 3rd floor. He executed the warrant anyway, because executing the warrant was what the warrant required, and Douglas Firth was, above all things, a man who did what the document in his hand required. He arrested Richard Cole on charges of unauthorized access to classified materials, unauthorized reproduction of classified documents, and impersonation of a federal officer in the execution of a records access. He read the charges in the flat, procedural voice of a man who understands that what he is doing is technically correct and strategically futile. Richard Cole listened to the charges with his hands clasped in his lap and said nothing until Firth had finished, and then said, "Is Dennis Hartwell going to be all right?" Firth looked at him for a moment, the long, evaluating look of a man recalibrating, and then said, "I don't know what you're talking about." Richard said, "That's what I thought." And he stood up and put his wrists forward for the handcuffs, and Firth put them on, and they walked together down 3 flights of stairs and out into the San Francisco fog, which had not lifted, and which showed no signs of lifting, and which lay over the city with the patient, indifferent permanence of something that had been there long before any of them, and would be there long after. The reckoning for Colonel Firth himself came not through Richard Cole's actions, but through the story's aftermath. Holloway's piece ran in the London Times on June 29, 1945. The Canadian piece ran the same day in the Toronto Globe. Within 72 hours, the Associated Press, freed by the existence of foreign coverage from the effective authority of the suppression directive, filed its own version. Within a week, every major American newspaper had run the story. The War Department issued a statement on July 2nd acknowledging the balloon bomb program, confirming the 6 civilian deaths, and attributing the press suppression directive to wartime operational security requirements. The statement did not mention the February sweep assessment. It did not mention Willow Wind. It did not mention the name Elsie Mitchell. Firth was transferred to an administrative posting in Washington that effectively ended his field career. He retired in 1952 with full honors and a commendation letter that said nothing about the winter of 1945, and was signed by 3 generals who had also said nothing about the winter of 1945, and who would continue to say nothing for the remainder of their respective careers. The justice was real. It was also, in the way that institutional justice almost always is, deeply, structurally, incomplete. The impossible choice came to Elsie Mitchell on the morning of July 5, 1945, in the form of a letter from a lawyer in Washington who represented, without naming them, a group of senior War Department officials who were prepared, in exchange for Elsie's public statement characterizing the balloon bomb deaths as a tragic wartime accident rather than a preventable consequence of a suppressed intelligence program, to offer a financial settlement, a formal letter of condolence signed by the Secretary of War, and this was the specific weight of the offer, the part that had been calculated with genuine psychological precision by someone who understood her, a guarantee that the children's names would be formally added to the official military casualty record of World War II with full honors, so that they would be remembered not as civilian accident victims, but as Americans who had died in service of their country's safety. The children's names: Dick Patsky, age 13, Jay Gifford, age 13, Edward Engine, age 13, Sherman Shoemaker, age 11, Joan Patsky, age 13, 5 children from Bly, Oregon who had gone into the woods on a Sunday morning and never come back, and whose deaths had been officially categorized in a way that made them invisible, that made them statistical, that made them the kind of loss that could be absorbed into the bureaucratic record without disturbing the surface of anything. The offer was to make them real, to make them named, to make them counted. And all it cost was Elsie Mitchell's silence, a smaller silence than the one that had already been imposed on her, a voluntary silence rather than a bureaucratic one, but silence nonetheless.
She sat with the letter for 3 days. She did not call Richard. She did not speak to her lawyer. She sat with it in the house in Bly in the mornings and the evenings, in the chair by the window where she used to keep the wool coat before she stopped wearing it, and she thought about her sister Clara holding her hand in the hospital in Medford and saying that her stomach didn't hurt anymore, which the nurse had said was not a good sign. She thought about her father trusting the institution, and the institution being wrong, and Clara being dead because of it. She thought about what it meant to accept, in the end, the institution's framing of its own failure. To let the people who had decided that 6 lives were an acceptable cost write the memorial language for those 6 lives. To let the architects of the silence choose the words that ended it. On the morning of July 8th, she wrote a single sentence on a piece of paper and mailed it to the Washington lawyer. The sentence was, "The children's names belong on the record because they are true, not because I have accepted your terms, and I will not accept your terms, and you should understand that the difference between those two things is the only thing I have left that is entirely my own." She did not accept the settlement. The children's names were never added to the official military casualty record. They are not there today. Elsie Mitchell knew when she made this choice that this was the likely outcome, and she made it anyway, and the making of it was the most complete expression of who she was that her life ever produced. Not the gap-toothed smile, not the rolled cuffs, not the hand on the stomach. This, the refusal to let the people who had decided her life was an acceptable cost decide the terms of its meaning.
Within 48 hours of Holloway's story reaching American newsstands, Archie Mitchell had given 3 interviews and received 24 letters from families across the Pacific Northwest who had found, or nearly found, or had their children nearly find, balloon bomb debris in the months between November 1944 and March 1945, and had been told by local officials that they had seen nothing, that there was nothing to report, that they should go home and not discuss it. The letters arrived at the parsonage in Bly in batches, forwarded from the newspaper that had first printed Archie's name, and Elsie read each one at the kitchen table with the methodical thoroughness of someone maintaining a record. She was maintaining a record. She kept every letter in a cardboard box that she labeled, in her neat school teacher's handwriting, with a single word: witnesses. Richard Cole was released on bail on July 3rd, after 11 days in federal custody. The charges against him were not dropped. They were suspended, pending review, which was the government's way of retaining leverage without committing to a prosecution that would require, in open court, the production of the very documents whose unauthorized reproduction constituted the charges. He walked out of the federal building in San Francisco into a July afternoon that was for once without fog, and he stood on the steps in the clear light and felt the particular exhaustion of a man who has done something irreversible and is only now beginning to understand all the ways in which irreversible things continue to cost you long after the moment of their commission. He called his mother from a payphone. She answered on the second ring, because she had always answered on the second ring, and the reliability of this, the lamp, the hot dinner, the second ring, was in that moment more comfort than he had words for. He told her he was out. She said she knew. She said she had been listening to the radio. She said, "Come home." And he said, "I will." And he did. By the spring of 1947, Elsie Mitchell had left Bly. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but in the gradual way that people leave places that have become primarily composed of what they have lost, incrementally, in stages, first emotionally, and then physically, until one morning you realize that the leaving has already happened, and what remains is only the administrative formality of forwarding your mail. She moved to Portland, where she found work as a secretary at a law firm whose senior partner had read about her in the newspaper and had the specific kind of decency that expresses itself through practical assistance rather than sympathy. She kept the cardboard box labeled witnesses. She added to it steadily over the following years, as more families came forward, as more letters arrived, as more people who had been told to say nothing decided, in the changed atmosphere of the post-war years, that the instruction had expired. By 1952, the box had become 3 boxes. By 1955, it had become a filing cabinet. She never published what was in it. She gave it in 1961 to a historian at the University of Oregon named Dr. Francis Aldwell, who used it as the primary source material for a monograph on civilian casualties and wartime press suppression that was published by the University Press in 1963 in an edition of 400 copies and reviewed in exactly 2 academic journals, neither of which had a wide circulation. The monograph is difficult to find today. Some library systems have it. Most do not. Elsie Mitchell never remarried. She lived in Portland until 1978, when she moved to a smaller apartment in Astoria, the same coastal town where Richard Cole's mother had arrived from Kyoto in 1911, though Elsie did not know this connection when she chose the place, or if she did, she never said so to anyone who recorded it. She died in 1989 at the age of 71, in the smaller apartment, in the early morning, quietly, in the way that people die when they have made their peace with the specific terms of their particular life. The gap between her front teeth was noted by the hospice nurse who attended her, who mentioned it to the nurse's aide, who said she had a great aunt who had a gap like that, and then the conversation moved on to other things, because that is what conversations do, and Elsie Mitchell passed out of the living world with the same combination of visibility and invisibility that had defined her existence within it. Richard Cole was never prosecuted. The charges against him were formally suspended in November of 1945 and never reinstated, a decision that was made somewhere in the War Department's legal apparatus without public announcement or explanation, and that Richard always attributed in the private accounting he kept to the calculation that a prosecution would require the production of documents that the government preferred to keep producing no further copies of. He left federal service in December of 1945. He spent the following decade working as a private investigator in San Francisco, a profession that suited his specific combination of skills and moral flexibility with an aptness that occasionally struck him as uncomfortably neat. By 1958, he had moved to Seattle, where he taught signals intelligence methodology at a small private security consultancy until his retirement in 1974. He visited his mother every Sunday until her death in 1961. He kept in a desk drawer in every office he ever occupied a small folded paper crane, not one of the originals which were held in government evidence archives, but a reproduction he had folded himself from a description in one of the military intelligence recovery reports, sitting at his kitchen table one evening in 1946, teaching himself the fold from a library book, getting it wrong 4 times before getting it right on the 5th attempt. He kept it because it was the most honest object he knew, a thing made by young hands for reasons that were not entirely understood by the hands that made them, sent across an impossible distance, and received by people who did not know what to do with it. He thought about it often. He never fully decided what it meant. Here is what the official record confirms. Between November 1944 and April 1945, the United States government received reports of approximately 342 balloon landings across North America. Of these, 285 resulted in confirmed debris recovery. 57 reports were classified as unconfirmed or inconclusive. 6 people died at Bly, Oregon on March 9, 1945. These are the confirmed facts. They are in the declassified record. They are available, with patience, to anyone willing to navigate the National Archives request system. Here is what the official record does not confirm. There are, in the classified sections of the Western Defense Command Archive, sections that were reviewed for declassification in 1972, 1989, and 2004, and that remain classified following each review under exemptions relating to ongoing national security considerations, approximately 400 pages of documents whose existence is acknowledged in the archive's finding aids, but whose contents are not. The finding aids describe these documents, in the bureaucratic language that finding aids use, as relating to technical assessments of recovered materials and associated operational planning. This description is accurate in the way that technically accurate descriptions are sometimes used to obscure rather than reveal. 400 pages of technical assessments of recovered materials and associated operational planning is a description that could mean many things. It could mean routine laboratory analyses of balloon construction materials. It could mean the Willow Wind biological operation planning documents. It could mean both. It could mean something else entirely, something that has not yet been named in any document that has reached the public record. In 1989, a researcher named Thomas Wickfield, working on a doctoral dissertation about the Fugo program at Stanford University, submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for the unreleased Western Defense Command documents. The request was denied. He submitted an appeal in 1990. The appeal was denied. He submitted a second appeal in 1991, and received in response a letter from the National Security Agency acknowledging that the documents existed, confirming that they remained classified, and stating that the classification review had determined that their release would reveal intelligence sources and methods that retained ongoing operational sensitivity. In 1991, 46 years after the end of World War II, Wickfield noted this response in a footnote in his dissertation, which was completed in 1993, and which, as of the most recent check of the Stanford Library Catalog,
has been checked out 11 times in 30 years. He died in 2018 without having seen the documents. His FOIA appeal remains technically open in the National Archives request system, because FOIA appeals do not close when the requester dies. They simply wait, in the bureaucratic silence where they were filed, for a review that has not yet been scheduled. There is one fact that cannot be explained. Among the balloon bomb debris recovered from the forests of the Pacific Northwest between November 1944 and April 1945, Army recovery teams documented, in several instances, small folded paper cranes tucked into the seams of balloon components. These were catalogued and archived. In the declassified recovery reports, their presence is noted without comment, a bureaucratic acknowledgement that they existed, that they were recovered, that they were filed under miscellaneous. What cannot be explained is this. In 3 separate recovery reports, from 3 separate sites in Oregon, Washington, and Montana, the cranes are described as containing, folded inside them, tiny slips of paper with handwritten characters. The characters were identified by military intelligence translators. They were not military markings. They were not serial numbers or production codes. They were, the translators reported, personal messages, brief ones. In 2 cases, the translator's notes indicate that the messages were prayers. In the 3rd case, the translator's note reads only, personal in nature, untranslatable without context, filed as non-operational. And then nothing. No further notation. No explanation of what the message said, or what context might have made it translatable, or what young hands had written it, or what they had believed they were sending it toward. The slip of paper is in a box in the National Archives. The box is in a room. The room is in a building. The building is in Maryland. And the message is still there, folded inside a crane, waiting for someone to ask the right question in the right language to the right institution, which has so far in 80 years not happened.
What this story reveals about human nature is not that people are capable of cruelty. We have always known that. It is not that governments lie, or that institutions protect themselves before they protect the people they are designed to serve. We have always known that too. What this story reveals, specifically, uncomfortably, in the particular way that only true stories reveal things, is that the most dangerous decisions are made by people who are right, not the sadists, not the ideologues, not the obviously monstrous. The most dangerous decisions are made by the careful men, the methodical men, the men who have run the calculations 3 times and arrived at the same answer, and have the intellectual honesty to acknowledge that the answer costs something, and the moral flexibility to pay that cost with someone else's life. Douglas Firth believed in the structure. Suiki Kusaba believed in reciprocity. The unnamed officer who wrote "confirmed" on the sweep assessment believed, probably, that he was being efficient. Each of them was, in their own framework, correct. And Elsie Mitchell put her hands on a wire in the snow, and the correctness of their various calculations announced itself in the only language that correctness of that kind ultimately speaks. What it means for us today is something that the digital age has made simultaneously more urgent and more difficult to see. The architecture of official silence has not disappeared. It has become more sophisticated, more deniable, more fluent in the language of transparency, more capable of producing the appearance of openness while maintaining the substance of concealment. The Press Suppression Directive of January 1945 required phone calls, personal visits, the physical presence of Peter Aldous Mercer in newspaper editors' offices across 3 states. Today, it requires a classification exemption, a server, and a form letter generated by a system that has never met anyone it has silenced. The silence is cleaner now. It leaves fewer fingerprints. It is harder to photograph with a Minox camera and carry out of a building in a shirt pocket. But it is the same silence. It is still load-bearing. It still extracts its cost from the people who are walking through the woods, trusting that the world they move through is as safe as the people responsible for its safety have promised it is. It is still, in the end, paid for by someone who made no calculation at all, someone who simply showed up, in good faith, to an ordinary Sunday morning, in a coat with the cuffs rolled back so her hands were visible. The question that haunts, the one that does not resolve, that does not yield to research or declassification or the passage of 80 years, is this. The young woman who folded a paper crane in a factory in Tokyo in 1944
who tucked a handwritten message inside it and sealed it into the seam of a balloon she believed was carrying weather instruments, who had no knowledge of what the balloon actually carried, or where it was actually going, or what it would actually do when it arrived. What did she write? What do you say, in the private language of a personal message, when you are 17 years old, and you are told to build something and send it into the sky, and you do not know and are not permitted to ask what it is for? What do you hope for, in the folded darkness of a paper crane, when the thing you are making is traveling towards a place you have never seen, carrying a weight you have not been told about, in a war you did not choose, towards a morning in the Oregon woods that you will never know happened? We do not know. The slip of paper is still in the box in Maryland. The box is still in the room. And whatever she wrote, prayer, name, wish, grief, the particular hope of a 17-year-old girl in a factory in 1944, who was doing what she was told, and trying, in the small space available to her, to make it mean something, is still folded inside the crane, in the dark, waiting.
If this story stayed with you, if it made you think, made you uncomfortable, or made you quietly angry at the particular kind of silence that wears the uniform of protection, then it did exactly what it was supposed to do. Drop a comment below with this question. If you had been a newspaper editor in January of 1945, and a government official sat across from you and told you that printing the truth might cost American lives, would you have stayed silent? I want to know where you land on that. Because the editors who received that visit all made their own calculation, and most of them said yes. And we will never fully know what that yes cost. If you found this channel for the first time today, subscribe now, because every story we tell here is one they tried to bury. Some were buried in government archives. Some were buried in redacted casualty reports. Some were buried in cardboard boxes labeled witnesses that only 400 people ever read. We bring them back. That is the only thing we do here. We bring them back. Next week, we cover the story they still won't fully declassify. The American POWs left behind in the Soviet gulags after World War II, and the government that pretended they didn't exist. That story is coming. Make sure you're here for it.